Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me here. So I'm going to talk about conversing with dreamers in REM sleep, new strategies for dream science. And please feel free to interrupt me at any time throughout the talk. I'd be happy to answer questions as we go along or talk about things. Cool. So the average adult is dreaming for about 2 hours every night, which equates to a month a year. And yet there's still a lot that's poorly understood about what's going on when we dream. How are dreams created in the brain? Does dreaming serve any function for waking life or for some other brain function? And how accurate are dream reports? So there's some theories about why we dream. And basically, okay, so I'm going to give you an overview just real quick. So there's one, the activation synthesis hypothesis, that dreams result from random activation originating in the brainstem. And so this theory might predict that the specific content of a dream is pretty random. There's another theory that we dream to simulate threats or social situations so that we'll be better prepared to deal with those situations if they come up in real life. And then there's some cognitive theories of why we dream. One is that dreaming helps with emotional adaptation. So if you experience an event that's really emotional, then dreaming might help you kind of separate that emotion from the memory of the event so that you can better utilize that memory without having to relive the emotion every time you think of it. There's another one that dreams help with problem solving and creativity. And a recent theory that dreams serve specifically to explore weak associations with areas of concern in our life to help us kind of understand the meaning and the implications, use those kind of like divergent thinking. So these are some, different theories about why we dream, but the truth is that there's not really a consensus and we don't really know why we dream. And so we're hoping that some of the methods that I'm going to talk about today will be good methods so that we can actually test these hypotheses, which have been pretty difficult to test in the past because it's difficult to conduct a really well-controlled study on a dream, which you can't control. And that's pretty important for an experiment. Great. So, and here's an overview of my talk. First, I'm going to give some background on how we measure dream content now. I'm going to talk about inducing lucid dreams, which is a dream where you're aware that you're dreaming while you're still asleep. And then I'm going to talk about our studies about communicating with dreamers. So our proof of concept study, some continued conversations that we've attempted, and also our foray into communicating in non-lucid dreams. And then finally, some future directions. So what methods do we have for figuring out what's going on in a dream? One is just that the person wakes up and tells us what the dream is. They give a dream report. But some critical issues with this is that there's a delay between when the dream happened and when the report was given. And there's also a state change. So the dream was had when somebody was asleep, and now they're reporting it when they're awake. And so these issues mean that dream reports are very likely subject to forgetting and also distortion. So we can't know exactly to what extent they're accurate. And yet we don't really know how far the gap is because we don't really have an objective measure of what happened in a dream. And they also have the limitation of poor timing precision. So if we want to understand the neural basis of something that's happening in a dream, we'd like to know it happened at exactly 250 milliseconds to 300 milliseconds. And with a dream report, we can't really tell that because everything is reported after they wake up. Is using neural decoding. So there's one study where one participant had a lucid dream in the fMRI scanner. And in their lucid dream, they did this eye movement and fist clenching task. And in the study, they were able to find that the same brain areas were active when they were doing the fist clenching task, those sensory motor areas, when they were in a dream as well as when they were awake. So this kind of demonstrates that the fMRI can be used to inform us about dream content, but it's quite difficult to get somebody to have a lucid dream in an fMRI scanner. There's another here's another study, and they used high density EEG. So they had EEG caps with like 200 plus electrodes. And then they also did a structural brain scan beforehand. And they were able to look at all the activity in the EEG and say, okay, here's parts of the brain that are less active, they're more sleepy. And then they were able to localize parts of the brain that were more active during sleep. And those areas that were more active were predictive of what people were dreaming about. So they were able to predict in real time if somebody had a dream or not. And then also were able to predict if they were dreaming about movement or a face. So kind of like broad categories with really easy to define brain regions. And then here's this final study that used decoding during sleep onset dreams. So these dreams were in REM sleep and like deep sleep throughout the night, but sleep onset is right as people were falling asleep, obviously. And so what this study did was they looked at a bunch of images while they were awake in these different, categories, just all sorts of images. And then they looked at what the brain activity looked like when people were looking at each image, and they trained an algorithm on that. And so then they applied the algorithm again as people were falling asleep to predict their dream content. So here's an example of that study. So here you can see, these are the categories at the bottom, character is really big. These are randomly selected images from those categories. And so building representation, food. And so you can see up here in the corner that the participant is going to wake up in 5 seconds, 4 seconds. Here they wake up, and this is what they were dreaming about. I was just looking at some kind of characters. There was something like writing a paper for composing an essay, and I was looking at the characters from the essay or whatever it was. So this is an example of how decoding can be used to, it got the category of what somebody was dreaming about, a character, and they used that because of where they were looking in the visual cortex, an area that can distinguish categories. But this, as you can see, these methods are still a little bit crude, and they might be complemented well with a method that could have information from the dreamer's perspective in real time. So that brings us to, So that brings us to lucid dreaming. So how do we know if somebody had a lucid dream? So one method is, as I said before, a report. So here's an example. I was on a roller chair and I was just rolling around the room and I instantly knew that it was a dream. So this is fairly typical of a lucid dream. You're having a non-lucid dream that's regular, and then you just have the realization, oh my gosh, I'm dreaming. But how do we know if this is genuine report? We use signal verification. So lucid dreamers can perform prearranged actions in their dreams, and certain actions correspond to things that can be objectively measured outside of the dream. So what we would ask the dreamer to do is we'd tell them while they were awake, here's the signal that you're going to give. So you're going to look left, right, left, right, left, right. And then they're hooked up to all these electrodes, and that while they're awake would look like this. So each of these blue lines comes from an electrode on their head, and then these red and black lines here are their eyes. And so as they look left, right, they have these big deflections in their eye channels. And we can see that there's 3, they look 3 times. And then here's also an electrode from their chin so that we can see their muscle activity and know for sure that they're awake. And here's an example of somebody doing that in REM sleep. So as you can see, the eye movement is still quite clear. Here's another one that's a little bit less dramatic. And they stand out a lot over the normal eye movements that happen in REM sleep, which look more like these. And we can also tell that they're asleep because their chin is paralyzed. You can see this line is thick, but this one is thin. And there's also a little bit of difference in their brain waves coming from their head. They're just a little bit more thin. There's a little less activity going on. And so that's how we can tell that they're asleep. So if anyone's ever tried to have a lucid dream before, you might know that it can be a little bit frustrating. So many lucid dreamers or aspiring lucid dreamers will often have the experience where they wake up in the morning from the craziest dream and they'll be like, shoot, of course that was a dream, but I just didn't realize it. And so it can be a little tricky to have people realize that they're in the dream, especially in the lab. So about 50% of the population will have a lucid dream at least once in their life, and 20% or more are more frequent lucid dreamers have a lucid dream at least once a month or more. But even if you have a lucid dream once a week, that's still not a very strong chance that you'll have one while you're wired up to electrodes in the lab. So to address this problem, we use some of what we know about sensory stimulation during sleep. So I don't know if any of you have had the experience of having your alarm clock go off while you're still asleep, and then instead of waking up, the alarm clock gets incorporated into your dream. So if any of you have experienced that, then you know that it's totally true that external stimulation during sleep can impact what you're dreaming about. So that's dream incorporation. And then we also tied this to the idea of targeted memory reactivation. So that's when you present a sound that's associated with a memory from before sleep, and you present that during sleep to selectively enhance that memory. So targeted memory reactivation isn't like, nothing about it says anything really about dream content. It's kind of an unknown really how much that method impacts your dreams, but it definitely impacts your memories. And what it also says is that dream incorporation is just like, okay, the stimuli gets incorporated into your dream. But with targeted memory reactivation, we know that it can be transitive. So we know that the stimuli goes to you while you're sleeping, and it doesn't just enhance the memory of your alarm clock or whatever. So for instance, the paradigm that's also often used is like, you have pictures on a grid, and each picture is in a specific location you have to remember and associated with the sound. And so when you play the sound of a picture, you remember the location of that picture better. And so we know that you can not only have things incorporated during sleep, but also bring another memory with it, bring the location memory with it. And so what we tried to do was bring the memory of lucidity with the sound to play during sleep. So this method we developed is called targeted lucidity reactivation. And so the goal of the study was basically, how little can we do and still have people have lucid dreams? So we had people come into the lab for a morning nap, and this was done at Swansea University. And so they came into the lab for a morning nap, and they didn't necessarily have any background with lucid dreaming. Then, while we wired them up to electrodes, we talked about the experiment and lucid dreaming. We talked about their dreams, and we just basically gave them the whole overview orientation of what lucid dreaming is. So as the participant was falling asleep, we did this training where we associated a sensory cue, so a flashing red light or a beeping noise that sounded like this, boop, 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 with a lucid state of mind. And so we would present a cue, and then we'd give a meditation afterwards. So it would be like cue, and then we'd say, as you notice the cue, you become lucid. Bring your attention to your thoughts. Notice where your mind has wandered. And we'd go on a little bit, and then we'd just present the cue alone and say, every time you hear this cue, get into this lucid mindset. Then participants would fall asleep. We do this just as they're falling asleep. And ideally, they're falling asleep in this point. So they're having sleep onset dreams where they can practice kind of becoming lucid during those little dreams. And then participants fall asleep. And once they enter REM sleep, we present the cues again. And so this technique worked pretty well. So these are the participants in the first bar who reported a lucid dream. Over 60% of the participants who were cued reported a lucid dream, and just over 20% reported one if they were not cued. Almost 70% of participants gave a lucid eye signal if they had been cued, but less than 20% gave one if they hadn't been cued. And then put these together, because sometimes one happened without the other. Over 50% of people reported and signaled that they had a lucid dream, whereas less than 20% did so if they were not cued. So next we looked at, how does this relate to their prior experience? So some of our participants had more frequent lucid dreams and some had never had one, but that didn't really seem to matter. These blue bars are the percentage of participants that had a signal verified lucid dream where they did the eye signals and reported a lucid dream. And the blue is just people who reported a lucid dream. So there weren't any differences here. And it's kind of cool that several participants had their very first lucid dream using this technique. So next I'm going to talk about our study at Northwestern and with 3 other labs where we used this method to induce lucid dreams and then communicated with dreamers in real time. So as I said, this data is from 4 different labs. And so each lab conducted their study independently. And then we put all the data together afterwards because we didn't know about each other when we were doing the studies. And then we all found each other and wrote a paper together. So to communicate into dreams, we asked, the French team actually asked yes or no questions using spoken words. And then the US and Dutch team asked math problems using spoken words during sleep. The German team asked math problems and they had their participants learn Morse code. So they encoded math problems using flashing lights and beeping tones and then had their participants decode the math problems during sleep. And the French team also used tactile stimuli. So they said, count how many times we tapped you on the hand while you were sleeping. Then to communicate out, all the teams used eye movements except for the French team. And so again, here's an example of a regular eye movement, and here is a lucid eye movement signal. And so what we did for the math problems was we said, look left, right once for each number in your response. So this would be if the answer was 3, and we chose easy math problems so that they didn't have to do too many eye movements. And then the French team used facial muscle contractions, which their dreamer felt like was more natural for them than eye movements. And so what they did was they had different codes for yes or no, or like how many times I've been tapped. And then they would contract their eyebrows or give a little smile. And that came across as a twitch on the EEG. So here's, So across all the teams, we had 35 participants that got questions asked to them during REM sleep. And that was in 57 sessions total. So nap sessions or overnight sleep, like bouts of overnight sleep. And then in 15 of these sessions, participants had signal verified lucid dreams. So for the rest of the analysis, we only looked at those questions that were presented during signal verified lucid dreams. So the participants had to give a signal first that they were lucid in order for us to look at the questions afterwards. Then we had blind judges go through all the data and verify that the participants were definitely in REM sleep, and also count the signals that were produced by them so that we could make sure we had an unbiased count of whether the answers were correct or not. So here's an example of participant answering a math problem during REM sleep. And so here's a chart of their sleep. You can see all their sleep stages. They go from wake to light sleep, deep sleep, light sleep, wake, light sleep. And then here at the end, they're in REM sleep. And so this blue arrow is where we presented the cue to help them become lucid, the beep, beep, beep associated with the lucid mindset. And then the red cue is where we asked some math problems. So here they are in REM sleep, and they're giving us the lucid signal. I'm lucid, I'm lucid. That was 3 left rights. So we asked, what's 8 minus 6? And they answered 2. And then we asked 8 minus 6 again, and they answered 2 again. And in their dream afterwards, they reported that they were in their favorite video game and they realized that they were dreaming. And then they started, the dream changed and they started hearing questions and from the outside, and they answered them with eye movements. And they remember that one of them was 8 minus 6. So how often were dreamers able to respond? Of 158 trials that were given during lucid dreams, 18.4% were answered correctly. Only 3.2% were answered incorrectly. No response was by far the most common. 60.8% of the time, dreamers didn't respond. And then another 17.7% of the time, we weren't sure if the response was correct or not, or whether or not they gave a response. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we think is going on in these no response trials. What leads to a non-response? One option could be that the answers fail to get out to the experimenters for some reason. So for instance, the dreamer could wake up, and this did seem to happen in certain instances, although it definitely didn't explain every instance of no response. Dream signals could also not get through. So a dreamer could complete a signal and that didn't get through. And for eye movement signals and the signals in this paper, that didn't seem to be the case from dream reports. There wasn't very many instances, I don't think any, where a dreamer reported doing a signal that we didn't see, but that was another thing that could happen and happens in some other studies. Or the dreamers could just forget to answer. So they could hear a math problem, but just not answer. And so there was one example of a participant who heard all these math problems in his dream, but he dreamt he was in another psych study answering math problems, so he didn't answer. Okay, so another reason why there could be a non-response is because the questions fail to get into the dream. And so I think this category is even more interesting. So one is that the questions are too quiet for comprehension. Another is that they could be so distorted that the dreamers can't answer. For instance, one time we had a dreamer who perceived a question 19 plus 6, and he was like, I'm not doing 25 eye movements, so I'm just not going to answer, which we didn't ask. Or the questions could be not perceived at all. So this probably is what's explaining a lot of these no responses. And it's interesting that within a single lucid dream, dreamers will hear some questions and answer them, and then just not perceive the other ones at all, in terms of they don't answer them and they don't remember them afterwards. And so it's kind of interesting to think about what allows you to hear something from the outside in a dream, and how does that shift even within the course of a single dream. So here's some more examples. This is from the Dutch team. We asked 1 + 2 and the dreamer answered 3. And in the dream, the question felt sort of like the radio in the car that the question was coming through. An example from the German team, they asked 4 - 0 in Morse code flashing lights, and the dreamer answered 4. And in the dream, the lights started flickering, and they recognized this as the flashing signal from the outside. And so this was a really interesting dream. Afterwards, the light stopped flickering, and the dreamer had to go look for something else that could flicker, a fishbowl tank that was flickering, and then the fishbowl broke, and then they went outside and the clouds were flickering. So there was other questions asked that I think he didn't answer as he was looking for the appropriate flickering device, but these do kind of demonstrate the interesting ways in which questions can get incorporated into a dream and still answered. And here's an example from the French team. They asked, do you watch football? And the dreamer gave the signal for no. And then they asked, do you like chocolate? And the dreamer gave the signal for yes. And before sleep, they had actually had the dreamers answer all these questions so that they would know what the correct answers were for that person. And then in the dream, the questions were coming through, they were at a party, and the questions were coming through from, the ether as though it was a god. So this is another interesting example of dream incorporation. And also, I just wanted to say that, well, I guess I'll get to that. So next, what we tried to do was questions to probe dream content in real time. So what I was going to say is that the reason that we asked these questions, sensory stimulation, yes or no, or math problems, is because we already knew the answers to those questions, and because they'd be relatively simple for a dreamer to answer with a limited number of codes. But in future studies, we'd like to ask questions that we don't know the answers to already. We can do math fine when we're awake. We don't need people who are dreaming to do it for us, but there's questions that dreaming people could answer that we couldn't get that information any other way. So what we sought to do was ask kind of like a tree diagram of different questions based on their answers. So first we asked, are you dreaming? And the dreamer would say yes or no. And then depending on what they said, we'd ask some follow-up questions, like for instance, can you see anything? And yes or no. And then it went on, and depending on how they answered, we'd have all these different questions that we would ask. So here's our forays into attempting this. So here's an example where we presented a light cue to a dreamer to induce lucid dreams, and they gave the signal for I'm awake. And so now I'm going to show the dream report that she gave afterwards. And just to note, she gave this dream report without knowing at all anything that was happening on the EEG. She just produced it all from memory. So she gives the signal for I'm awake, actually one more than the signal for that. And then in the dream, here's what she's experiencing. I see a flash of lights through my closed eyes and think, oh shit, the cops. Then I realize it's not the cops, it's the lucid signal. I got excited and accidentally signaled left, right 4 times instead of 2. Then she gives the signal up, down, no, and then the signal left, right, here, which here means I'm lucid. In her dream, she says, I realized that was too many. So I signaled up, down twice for no, as in no, I'm not awake. And then signaled left, right twice, as in yes, I'm lucid. So I'm sitting in the experimenter room looking at all this and being like, okay, I'm not completely sure what just happened, but she definitely knows she's dreaming and is communicating. So based on that, I asked the question, are you dreaming? And she gave this signal for yes, but it was a little unclear. So I asked again, are you dreaming? And she answered yes again. But here's what was going on in her dream. I was like, yeah, we're talking, like, let's ask other questions. But shortly thereafter, she woke up and here's what was actually happening. She said, next, I heard a question play over the speakers, but I couldn't make out what it was saying. I didn't know how to indicate that I couldn't hear the question clearly, so I just signaled yes. That's here. Then I heard it again, but couldn't make it out again. Again, I signaled yes. Then I realized it was probably the question that goes, can you hear me? Which was the practice question. And I accidentally answered yes both times because I couldn't hear it. I thought, oh shoot, that's gonna mess things up. So this demonstrates that a dreamer is definitely capable of having an involved conversation with a lot of thought on their end, but there's still some limitations. They couldn't hear us clearly, and they also just didn't have the vocabulary that they needed in order to communicate what they wanted to say, which is kind of a limitation of using just simple eye movement codes. So here is another example where we presented a light cue and the dreamer again gave the signal for I'm awake during REM sleep. And so then we asked the question, are you dreaming? And they gave the clear signal for no, I'm not dreaming. And so when we asked them later, they said they just felt like they were awake. But it's kind of interesting that this participant isn't lucid because they don't know that they're dreaming and yet they're in REM sleep. And so this kind of brings us to the next set of experiments about attempting to communicate in non-lucid dreams. So the inspiration for this experiment came from a dream that we had in the first study about inducing lucid dreams. So here's what the participant reported. I sat at my dinner table. Every time I could hear the noise, I was trying to do the eye movements, the noise to induce lucidity. We asked, were you aware that it was a dream? And they said, no, not really. I didn't know why I was doing it, but I just felt like I had to do it. It was just like I was eating dinner at home. And so they had given some pretty clear eye movements. And so this led us to think, like, that's pretty cool. They didn't know they were dreaming, and yet the sound just directly induced an action in their dream. And so based on that, we were kind of thinking, like, to what extent do you even need lucidity to communicate with somebody in a dream? Maybe you could just directly have a sound induce an action or a specific dream content, which would be even more interesting, or a dream content that you could monitor objectively with an action. So that's what we tried to do. So here's the design. We had 17 participants, and cues, instead of being associated with lucidity here, they were associated with rehearsing a specific task. And we didn't mention lucidity at all during the training. So everything else was the same. They came in the morning, we wired them up and explained the experiment and talked about dreams, but not lucid dreams. And then before sleep, every time they heard a sound, we did this task that I'll go into more on the next slide. And then while they were in REM sleep, we presented the cues again to try to trigger the task. So here's the task that we used during wake. And so the idea of the task was that it was supposed to be something that we could monitor objectively while they were still sleeping, and B, it was supposed to be a stepwise increase in the level of difficulty and interaction with the dream. So first we'd present a cue, and then the participant would look left, right, left, right. And so these eye movements are just to indicate that they've done each step of the task. Then they just clench their fists in the dream. And if they were awake, they just clench their fist when they're awake. They'd give more eye movements, and then they'd pick up an object in the dream and clench it. And when they were awake, they just imagined picking up an object in the dream and clenching it. And then here they gave more eye movements again, look left, right. And then they'd throw the object, catch it, and clench it again. And then they'd look left, right at the end. And so, sorry, I forgot to say, but this EMGR, that's an electrode on their forearm. So that is what's monitoring if they're actually making that twitching signal during REM sleep. And we can also see here that they're activating their fist a little bit during wake. And so we associated the cue with this entire sequence of actions. And every time we presented it as people were falling asleep, they did the whole sequence of actions. And so here's an example where we presented a cue during REM sleep, and the participant did the whole sequence of actions. You can see the eye movement, twitch, eye movement, twitch, eye movement. Twitch is really small here, eye movement. And they're completely paralyzed like normal in REM sleep, but throughout the task, their brain waves come to look more like they're awake, which is really interesting because this is a state that is really unusual to see. And so afterwards, they felt like they woke up after this experience, and they remember, they don't really remember a detailed dream, but they vaguely recall doing something similar to the task. So we were really hoping that somebody would like start picking up objects in their dream and throwing them around, and that didn't seem to happen, but it is kind of interesting that they did the physical part of the task in this mixed state. And so here's another example where the participant had a lucid dream, even though we didn't talk about that at all. And here they did the task in REM sleep. So here's them doing it while they're awake. And then here we played a cue, and they did only 3 sets of the 4 eye movements. And in their dream, they were in a volleyball locker room, and they clenched their fists, and then they picked up a volleyball and clenched it. And then they threw the volleyball, caught it, and clenched it again. And so that's an interesting example where they reported doing those clenches, yet on their wrist electrode, the twitches didn't come through. And so sometimes, twitches are proposed as an alternative to eye movements. And the French team had a lot of success using facial twitches, but here we're trying to use forearm twitches, and they didn't reliably come through. The dreamer reported doing them, but we didn't see them. Cool. So that was our foray into non-lucid dream communication. And overall, the dream communication is kind of still at the carrier pigeon stage. So we present questions. Sometimes they get our messages, sometimes they don't. They answer, sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't. But really, we'd like to be at the Zoom stage where we could just have a really in-depth conversation with a lucid dreamer in another country or whatever. And so how are we trying to get there? So we're trying to optimize the communication so that we can move slightly farther away from the carrier pigeon stage. So one thing that we're doing that I was talking about before the talk was starting with overnight experiments and experienced lucid dreamers. So in our original study with the math problems, those were during morning naps, but that doesn't give you so much time to ask questions because they're not in REM sleep and dreaming for as long. So overnight experiments, there's a lot more time to try to communicate. And then we're also trying to go with much more experienced lucid dreamers. So in our induction study, I talked about how you didn't necessarily need to be an experienced lucid dreamer in order to have a lucid dream with that method. But we found out that answering math problems is kind of tricky to do in a dream. And so if you've never had a lucid dream and we're wiring you up and we're like, okay, and then you're going to have this experience you've never had, and then you're going to answer math problems in it, it can be a little tricky for people to deal with all that and also fall asleep. So we started using experienced lucid dreamers and bringing people in the lab multiple times to help with that part of the, And we're also using respiratory signaling as an alternative to eye movements, which I'll talk about more in the next slide. And finally, we're also testing lucid dream induction methods with an app, since we're hoping that we could troubleshoot some common issues and increase the level of lucidity in the lab without putting as many hours into it. So here's an example of respiratory signaling. We presented a sound cue, and the participant was instructed to look left, right to say, I'm lucid. And then they were instructed to give some sniffing signals. So this is 3 sets of quick inhalations. They go, and it's great because you can see it's pretty quick to perform, a little quicker than the eye movements. The dreamers report it to be really easy and natural. And we're also hoping that we could use this method to do more studies on the visual experiences in dreams, which eye movements can kind of mess up. sometimes. So, oh, sorry. And so to measure it, we just put this nasal cannula on people while they're, we put it on them as part of the whole electrode setup. And then we just measure it like this. Yeah. And so here you can see that they're breathing really normally beforehand. And then the sniffing signal is really distinct. And it seems more reasonable that it would come through every time because your breathing corresponds to how you're breathing in a dream. Cool. So finally, this is our lucid dreaming app where we're trying to take our method for inducing lucid dreams and bring it home. So participants who are using the app get the lucidity training at home before bed, that same 20-minute training. And then after they fall asleep, instead of detecting REM sleep, we present the sounds again after 6 hours. And the sounds gradually increase in volume because if they're in, for instance, really, really deep sleep at one volume, that might not impact their sleep mentation at all, but in REM sleep, it might need to be a different volume. So we tried to have it kind of fluctuate throughout the night. And then if the participant moves or wakes up, then the app pauses and reduces the volume again. And so we're hoping that by doing this gradual increase and reduction, we can catch the participants' like sweet spot of volume that could get incorporated into a dream. So in a preliminary experiment, participants used the app for 1 week, and 18 out of 21 participants had at least one lucid dream because of hearing the cue in a dream. So this is not quite as good as the in-lab version, and maybe there's some different variables that affect it, such as like they're not coming into a lab, but we're hoping that we can tweak the app and kind of optimize it, do some different control studies and stuff, and see if we could have a really reliable method for inducing lucid dreams at home, so that way people could practice and also we could use what we learned to induce them better in the lab. So future studies that we're planning, here's one that we're planning to illuminate dreamers' perceptual experiences and how they are produced. So some background for this study is when people are awake and their eyes are open, their brain waves look like this, fairly desynchronized, and they're seeing stuff because they're awake and their eyes are open. So when they close their eyes and they're awake, they get this distinctive neural signature called alpha, and they see nothing because their eyes are closed. And so alpha has been hypothesized connected to various things, but one of them is like kind of stalling of the visual system. So there's nothing coming in, and so the alpha oscillations are just like keeping it in neutral while there's no visual information. So in REM sleep, brainwaves look a lot more like they do when your eyes are awake, although your eyes are closed because you're dreaming. And so what we're going to ask people to do is in a dream, close your eyes. So obviously their waking eyes are closed, but in a dream, are their eyes closed? And so some preliminary studies suggest that, AKA my friends and I trying this, that when you close your eyes in a dream, sometimes the visuals go away, sometimes they stay the same, and sometimes they change or they go away and then they come back. So what we predict is that depending on what happens to the visuals in REM sleep, that might determine the, EEG oscillations behind it. So for instance, if somebody closes their eyes in a dream and they see nothing, maybe they'd get alpha oscillations like they do when they're awake. And you can think back to that example I mentioned earlier where the participant was, they had these alpha oscillations and yet they were paralyzed like they were in REM sleep. So, or maybe the visuals will stay the same, and then we predict that the brain waves would stay the same. Or if the scene changes, it'd be interesting to see if we could decode when there was a shift in dream imagery based on these brain waves. And even if our hypothesis that alpha oscillations will increase is nullified, I think that would be super interesting because now it's kind of saying, okay, how are dream visuals and the lack thereof created in the brain? And is that supported in the same way as waking visuals are, or is there some differences because it's a different state? Cool. So just a discussion, this is kind of a third method of probing dream content, along with dream reports and neural decoding, where we can start to look at some of these questions in more detail. How are dreams created? Does dreaming serve a function? And how accurate are dream reports? So yeah, we're hoping that, like, for instance, this study, it could be an important piece of the puzzle to how dreams are created, because visuals are a really important part of dreams. And so if we can understand how the visuals are supported by the brain, that could help us understand how dreams are held in the brain in general. So here's some applications of these studies. So there's some scientific applications, and one is to test theories of dream function and generation. So a really, a new way to do that wasn't available before is to assign tasks during dreams. So for instance, I mentioned all those theories at the beginning: simulating a threat, creative problem solving, emotional memory processing. In order to test those studies before, even if you had somebody who was a lucid dreamer try to simulate a threat in their lucid dream, there's a big confound about beforehand. You have to tell them, okay, you're going to simulate this threat. And so while they're falling asleep, they have to, focus on trying to incubate a dream about simulating the threat. While they're in deep sleep, they might be preferentially processing that threat that they know that they are trying to dream about. And so by the time they get to REM sleep, even if they dream about a threat and have an effect, it's still unclear whether the dream actually caused that effect, because there was all this stuff that happened beforehand. And the same goes for instance, working on a problem that they want to solve. So if we can get people in a dream and tell them in the dream, like, yes, you're going to work on, problem C of all the problems that you learned before sleep, now there's no confound, because they don't know which thing they're going to do until they're dreaming. And then if they do it in a dream, we can have a better controlled study to see how does dream content specifically and the actions completed in a dream relate to waking performance the next day. We could also move more close to quantifying dream report distortion. So historically, it's been really difficult to do this, and some philosophers even argued it's impossible to quantify how distorted dream reports are. But now we have these conversations, so we have kind of it's not perfect, but like an objective account of what happened in a dream. And then we get reports afterwards, and already we can see that it's kind of interesting. In our studies, participants almost always reported doing the math problems, answering the questions in some way, but they often forgot details or misremembered details and reported math problems that they never answered or something like that were never asked. So hopefully we can understand a little bit more about that. And then another avenue that I'm also excited for is comparing cognitive abilities during REM sleep and wake. So there's a lot of hypotheses, but we're hoping that this could help us come to more solid conclusions about what's really unique about REM sleep. And also, like, most of psychology is based on studies of people who are awake. And so, all these different, like, what can you see? How much can you remember? How much information can you hold in memory? Once you have the ability to talk with somebody in two ways, you could start adapting psychology experiments that have only been done on people who are awake and give them to people who are in REM sleep. And so I think, for instance, it'd be interesting to test like the global workspace theory of consciousness, where like when a perception comes into consciousness, it creates this global, ignition of brain activity. But does that...
Finden die das Rad wieder neu?
Sorry, but we don't know if that, and they talk about how this really happens a lot, but it'd be interesting to see if some of those foundations of theories hold true for this other state of consciousness that we're all naturally in for 2 hours a day. So there's also some practical applications of dream communication, and so one of those is to help lucid dreamers accomplish goals. So it's very common for lucid dreamers to forget what they wanted to do, or kind of get caught up in dream logic that prevents them from doing what they wanted. So there's one study that used experienced lucid dreamers and had them try to complete a flying task. And I think only half of the people that had a lucid dream were able to complete that task. And so with communication, you can combine the, you know, exploratory and creative aspects of dreaming with the logical and, you know, maybe better memory aspects of wake to kind of improve both of those things. And another practical application is to potentially intervene with dysfunctional dreaming. So for, you know, a similar reason, it's quite common for people who have frequent nightmares or PTSD to have even lucid nightmares where they're aware that they're dreaming, but they can't control it or really do anything to improve the situation or change their perspective. And so now they're lucid. So if you had two-way communication with somebody in the middle of a nightmare, you could kind of have like real-time therapy in a scary situation. And maybe that would be helpful for people who aren't able to like work with their dreams in a good way, even if they're lucid. Cool. So that's my whole talk. And thank you so much to all the people who help with these projects. And thank you so much for listening. And I'd love to talk about it some more if you have questions.